Hey there, I'm Sal, and thanks for checking out the video. Today I'm going to be addressing some pretty significant oil leaks on the SR20 in my S13. You'll see it in a few clips here, but there's just oil everywhere on this motor, and I figured it was about time to address it. The oil all around the top of the motor led me to think that the valve cover gasket was bad, and all the oil and gunk on the front of the timing cover, and just really the whole front of the engine, pointed me towards a bad front main seal. I got started with taking off the hood to make some extra space, along with the strut tower brace. Next I started disassembly with removing the PCV hoses and the coil packs. This has been a project on my to-do list for a while now, but I haven't done a valve cover seal or a front main seal before, so I naturally just kept procrastinating it. Here you can see just how nasty this engine really is and why the job needed to be done so bad. It was honestly the first time I got to see how bad it was on the backside too, because I haven't taken the hood off yet. You can also see the oil all along the base of the valve cover and all down the sides, and a nice little bonus treat there of a missing nut on that turbo outlet, so that's great. Looking in the spark plug holes, nothing crazy there. In the video it looks like there's a leak on cylinder 3 a little bit, but it didn't look as bad in person, and hey, that's why we're replacing the gaskets. Popping off the valve cover here, it's really just as easy as removing all the cap nuts and then the two sets of washers below them. There's the metal one and then the rubber one beneath it. With everything laid out on the table, we were able to inspect everything once again. The underside of the valve cover looked fine. There was a good amount of baked on oil, which I tried to clean up a bit before putting it back on the engine, but I really didn't take too much time making it look perfect. One thing I was surprised by was this baffle that was secured to the top side and had all this steel wool looking stuff underneath it, which is there to help reduce excess oil from being sent out through the PCV hoses. I'm not sure if it's stock or if someone else put this in, but whoever did it used a lot of RTV, especially on this little drain thing here. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be like that or not. The top side of the engine looked pretty clean with minimal varnish, which makes me feel a little bit better about the health of the motor. It at least has been having regular oil changes. You can also see the Tomei rocker arm stoppers that were installed by a previous owner as a preventative measure. I was told that these were Tomei pon cams as well, but I don't really know how to verify that. Here's some other beauty shots of all the dirt and grime that I took a lot of time to clean up before reinstalling the valve cover. Another thing I wanted to dedicate some time to was cleaning up all of the nuts and washers that secure the valve cover. They were super gross, and I always think that SR20s with clean engine hardware look really nice, so I wanted to get as close to that as possible without dropping a ton of money on brand new stuff from Nissan. So I started with swishing them around in some degreaser, which took off a bunch of the big chunks, but really didn't shine them up at all. So I went ahead with a fine Scotch-Brite pad and basically just sort of buffed them to a nice clean finish. They're by no means perfect, but they do look a ton better than they did before. I mean, just check out what they looked like when I took them off the car. Starting the reinstall process next, the first step after cleaning up the mating surfaces was to apply some RTV to the half moon cutouts on the front and back of the motor. I did some research beforehand, and it seems like most people were good with just using gray RTV, but I don't know if there's a better option out there, or frankly if it even matters what you use. One thing I would do differently is I just globbed a ton of it straight out of the tube and then went back with my fingers to spread it out and remove the excess, but I'm worried that this is going to seal poorly, and I'm expecting to have to redo this again in the future. In hindsight, I think the better way to do it would just be to use a smaller nozzle to lay down a little bead that can be compressed when you set down the valve cover. I just feel like that would give a better seal, but I'll keep you updated on how my method's holding up in the future. Next, of course, I threw on the new gaskets and set the cover back down. I guess it's a mark of a good gasket when it stays put in its groove when you're placing it down, so that made it pretty easy. So that just about wraps up the valve cover gasket replacement. I just needed to reattach the 3 PCV hoses and then of course the coil packs and their plastic cover. Overall, it was a simple job and definitely doable as a quick afternoon project, especially if you don't plan to clean up all the little nuts and bolts, which is really what consumed most of my time. But next I had to tackle the front main seal. What sparked this newfound motivation was a huge coolant puddle that I found under my car one morning after driving it daily for about a week. So I think it was the water pump leaking, so I'm in the process of fixing that up now, and that video will be out soon. But that's why I opted to drain the radiator and pull a bunch of the stuff on the front side of the engine off. I believe that the front main seal could be replaced with everything else there, doing it from the bottom, but taking all this stuff out definitely gives you good access to the crank pulley and the front main seal, so I would definitely consider it if you're planning to do the job yourself. In my case, it also gave me an opportunity to clean up the absolute mess that I had on the front cover of the engine. There's literally just so much gunk there, and you could just scoop it off with your finger, it was so thick. So after removing those radiator hoses to let a little bit more coolant drain out, I went ahead and actually threw them back on so I could spray down the engine with some degreaser and get it cleaned up a little bit. To get started on the front main seal project, I just blasted off the crank pulley bolt with my mid-torque impact, and then went over to Harbor Freight and picked up their 3-jaw puller set, and I found that their 6-inch one, the biggest one in the set, fit over the crank pulley nicely and still gave me good clearance to the radiator. I recently upgraded my wrench set to these awesome ratcheting wrenches, which came in really handy here to work the puller without worrying about hitting the radiator fins with the big socket hanging off the front of it. When I've used ball joint separators or other pullers in the past, the center screw always wants to walk around on the bolt that it's pressed up against, but what's cool here was that the crank pulley bolt actually had like an inverted cone shape in the center, which accepted the tool perfectly, and it kept it centered, which was pretty sweet. The problem I was running into was that the crank pulley bolt was actually spinning and tightening while I was trying to use the puller, so it was effectively fighting against itself, and I've just found that using this adjustable wrench in there on the bolt kept it in place enough to use the puller the rest of the way and free up that crank pulley. Pulling it off the rest of the way, and man, you can see just how nasty it is back there, especially compared to the upper part that I was able to reach and already had cleaned. So you can also see the fresh oil dripping from the bottom side of the seal, which kind of confirmed to me that this needed to be replaced. Jeez. As far as pulling out the old seal, I was definitely a little bit naive about how difficult it was going to be to get out. I tried using my super cheap pick tools and got basically nowhere. I actually ended up ripping the seal on the backside and pulling out the little metal spring thing that sits inside of it. I was trying to be especially cautious because I was really worried about marring up the surface that the seal sits inside, but I knew I needed more force than that little pick was giving me, so I opted to use a screwdriver, and I basically pried against the seal using that little key bit on the crank for leverage. It actually worked really well, and if you're careful about it, you won't have any issues with marring up that surface. Unfortunately, one of the previous owners didn't know this trick apparently and completely dug a huge gash into that bottom right of the opening there, so I feel like that's probably what was contributing most to the leaky seal, and unfortunately this replacement may not solve my leaking problems either. Regardless, we're here now, and I don't know, maybe a new seal will actually fix it. So here I've got a new seal from Nissan, and we can start putting everything back together. I added some fresh oil around the seal and then started pressing it back into place. I can only get it so far with my fingers, so I ended up using the biggest socket that I have, which is a 36 mil, and tapped it into place with a rubber mallet. A bigger socket would be better, but I was able to make do with what I had. I just went until the seal was recessed the same distance all the way around, and it looked and felt nice and secure in there. I also took some time to clean up the rest of the front timing cover down at the bottom where I couldn't reach before. You can't see most of this once the crank pulley and fan shroud and everything's back in place, but I definitely could not leave it the way that it was, and it'll also help me to see if there's any new leaks down the road or in a week. Throwing the crank pulley back on, I just made sure it was all cleaned up, especially where it sits against the inside of that new seal. I just pulled it on with the bolt and then torqued it down. To torque it, I needed to put the car in gear and then went to 110 foot-pounds. It really wasn't the easiest thing to torque, and I kind of needed to use some momentum to get it, but once all that was back together, the front main seal job was basically done. It looks nice and clean in there now, and I feel a whole lot better about putting everything back together, knowing that I cleaned it up as good as I could without driving myself too crazy. I'll be finishing up the coolant system overhaul in the next video and then button everything up then, so expect that coming soon. But for now, it just feels really good for these two things to be done. Even if I'm still kinda expecting to have some leaks down the road from one or both of the things that I replaced, I'm just itching to drive this thing again, so I cannot wait to get it all finished up. So with that, thank you so much for watching, thanks for subscribing, and have a great rest of your day.